Listen up.
Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your host, Andrew Plaw.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the PowerShell Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Plaw, at Andrew Plaw Tech, and there's a very exciting episode in store for you today. We have curated. We have a longtime programmer. Greg Martin's going to talk to us about a game that he developed in PowerShell and more. As 19 years as a developer, you're going to have some unique perspectives. And I think Greg has some hot takes in store for us today. Greg, welcome to the show.
Hey. Thanks for having me.
That's Greg Martin, for those out there wondering. Not Greg Smith, different programmer.
Formerly Greg Smith. But,
it's... Life has a way, right?
A man grows,
and sometimes a man puts on a green t-shirt. It's just fitting.
See, either you stole it or I stole it, and nobody's ever going to know.
Well, I did see your shirt first because you presented at PowerShell Wednesday earlier today.
That's
Wednesday,
right.
2 p.m. Eastern, PDQ, discord.gg/PDQ. You presented about some of what we'll talk about today, the game. And what's the game called?
Unfortunately, it's called Eldoria. I don't have a better name for it. I'm actually pretty terrible at naming things, but it's the title.
That's the hardest part, right?
Yeah,
naming things is...
Yeah. Any programmer will tell you that's the worst part about programming is naming something. So,
but this is a game written in PowerShell that is quite extensive. It's what kind of graphical style would you call the game? Like old school. I mean, that's what I'd use, but there might be a better...
Yeah, I think there's an actual term for it. I wouldn't know what it is, but I just call it text-based adventure with some modern niceties, some quasi-modern niceties associated.
Yeah, because this takes place in the terminal.
Yep.
Right. Yep. So you just kind of run it from there.
Entirely terminal-based. Yeah, if you have Windows Terminal, you're going to love life with this, which you should be using Windows Terminal. I mean, why not?
Agreed.
Yeah.
So I got to get to the why because, and we'll cover some of the things that will help people understand how extensive this project is. Because you have a lot of programming experience outside of PowerShell, and looking at your presentation, let me tell you, you're tapping into it just a little bit here. There's a lot at play here. So what was going on in your world when you decided like, hey, let me spend a ton of time and write an awesome game in PowerShell?
I think it really comes from like a gamer's desire to make a game. Really, I mean that's why I started programming all those years ago. I grew up playing Nintendo at the age of 3. Kind of just worked I was never a PC gamer though, but I always had these ideas of what I wanted text-based adventure games to be or what they should look like, and that kind of stayed with me as I aged up and then started doing programming and scripting and so on and so forth. And I've tried to do some text-based games over the years in like C and C++, but as any C or C++ programmer knows, those are pretty torturous languages to use. I do have a bit of an affinity for C#, but I think what really drew me to PowerShell is that there is kind of an inherent simplicity. It does have a relation to C#, but it's a little simpler to use, and you can be a bit more expressive with a lot of the shorthand that's in there. And I really just wanted to make a text-based game to see what I could really for giggles, just to see what I could do. So I started writing it in PowerShell, and I got maybe like, I don't know, a basic window going. And I had some conflict as to whether I wanted to keep doing PowerShell because I realized, this thing is going to be substantially more complex logically, operationally than what I think PowerShell could do. But I decided to torture myself and keep going even further with it. And it turns out, with the object-oriented syntax that's in the language, you don't have all of the object-oriented capabilities in PowerShell, but there's enough there that you can express complicated things like this and actually build the game out. So once I figured that out, it all kind of just fell into place, and I just kept running with it, and that's where we're at.
So you kind of dabbled with game development, but not text-based game development in the past.
Yeah, I was doing homebrew development back in the day. I think my first game projects I started were in C and C++ using the Allegro library, if anybody remembers that. I I like doing 2D graphics programming. Don't get me wrong, but I don't know. There's just something about a text-based, like a strict terminal emulator that just I have a strong attraction to, and I always wanted to be able to do something like that. So, I didn't know how to do that, so I started doing like Game Boy development, which was a little bit more close to the metal assembly language, that sort of stuff. And while I felt like emotionally connected to it in a certain way, it still kind of wasn't what I wanted to do. So then that's what led me up to saying, "Oh, hey, I have time. I've got this thing called PowerShell here. I'm doing terminal work with it all the time. Why don't I see if I can do something else with it?" And that's where it came from.
Do you think that the convenience of PowerShell compared to the Game Boy development was sort of also part of why you were more attracted to it? Because you're sort of there every day anyways. You're kind of, seems like the workflow might be simpler.
Yeah, well, I mean, the terms of the game logic itself, I would say expressing the game logic in a language that's a bit more abstract, like PowerShell, is a lot easier than doing something like an assembly or in C, where you're so low level that you can't take advantage of constructs that we would normally take advantage of, like something simple like arrays or something simple like hash tables, for example, specifically hash tables. You either have to invent the wheel yourself again with lower level languages like that, and it may not even work correctly. So there's a lot of headache to basic things like that, as opposed to, well, with PowerShell and even other like C#, for example, all that stuff's already there. So it takes a lot of the brain work out of that stuff and allows you to focus really on the meat of the program, the meat of the game itself.
Interesting. Now, we're talking, this is more of the fun side of things, right? We haven't really mentioned anything work related. Who likes that? Ooh, just kidding. We got bills to pay. We like our employers. Thank you. But speaking of work, did you encounter PowerShell in the work context, or what was your first exposure to PowerShell?
Yeah, so back in Windows 7 days, I've always wanted to try to use PowerShell for some type of orchestration. I was never really a big fan of the classic Windows command line interface. That just, I don't know. Of course, you can get around it and stuff like that, but I never was a big fan of it. PowerShell comes along, and here a guy like me whose brain fundamentally works with object-oriented design, everything's an object, that kind of stuff. PowerShell's like, oh, this is amazing. I can do this for like my everyday tasks and even do some automation. But the opportunities just weren't really there even back then. It just wasn't enough really for me to do with it. Fast forward a few years later, I'm working as a network designer for an industrial controls automation company, and these networks are fairly complex. Cisco routers, firewall switches, vCenter servers everywhere, redundancy out the wazoo, and we had an opportunity to facilitate like the orchestration and the redundancy between the vCenter nodes with like Power CLI through VMware. So that was another opportunity, and then also doing like database backups with MySQL, interacting with Veeam for tape backups. All that stuff was facilitated and automated with PowerShell and scheduled tasks that would run on dedicated runners on these vSphere instances. Fast forward to my current employer, Progressive. They use PowerShell extensively on the Windows side. I'm a Linux engineer. We do use PowerShell somewhat on the Linux side of the house for some automated builds, but you're dealing with Linux guys, so so you're not going to get PowerShell too far with a lot of them. And I have good fun poking at them because I am a PowerShell enthusiast and they are not. So
now, are you PowerShell enthusiast post this project or before this project?
Before, before. I've wanted to use PowerShell more extensively professionally. Never just really had the opportunity to. And with the position with the industrial controls networks, that was kind of like the first big, hey, we can automate a lot of this stuff using PowerShell and just sit back and watch it beautifully go and do whatever it needs to do. And just trying to think of imagining doing that without PowerShell through some other means was kind of painful, to say the least, because the options weren't good. And it's because a lot of these, especially in industrial applications, a lot of these networks are air gapped. So you kind of have to build it, test it, and it's got to run reliably, 200% of the time. And PowerShell did that for us. So And it does it here at Progressive too. I mean, like I said, a lot of our build automation is backed by a PowerShell backend, and it's pretty damn reliable every time. So,
well, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
All right. Enough work talk. Can we get back to the game? No offense. But I would like it if possible. Would it be all right if we got a little, maybe 3 to 5 minute little demo? And for those who are listening, you'll have to tune into YouTube for this part. But we'll describe it to a certain extent, right? I mean, ultimately, we want people to play the game and kind of experience it in your own terminal.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah, I could show it off here. So the game is, hopefully it's up on the screen now. The game is, I would still consider it to be in somewhat like a tech demo state. There's still a critical portion missing, like what I would call the event system, which drives a lot of, it facilitates driving narratives and, finding objects, moving a storyline along, completing events and quests, and so on and so forth. That hasn't been completely fleshed out yet. But as far as like establishing map builds, moving around in them, there's a functional combat system that it needs balance, but it's there. It works. Inventory management and player stat control. That's all in place. So with what you can see here on your screen is basically what I would call the navigation screen. And this is how you move around the game world. The game is controlled via text commands. So like move, take, look, examine, those kinds of actions. Those are words that you would use to interact with the world. Over here on the right is probably one of the bigger gimmicks of the program, which is what I would call a scene image. And this is basically a view of the current area in the map. So you can see you're on like a grassy plain. There's a little bit of a river going in the background there, some clouds in the sky. It's all cute.
Why do you call it a gimmick?
Well, it's really not an image, right? I mean, everything that you're seeing on the screen here is nothing but a very, very, very carefully crafted string. There's some technology at play that it's old technology to be sure, but it's technology that uses what's called ANSI escape sequences. And through a very careful combination of these things and white space characters, we're able to generate what looks to be like an image, right? Same thing over here. This is all text, the name, the HP, the way it's colored, everything is text. So that's why I call it a little bit of a gimmick. It looks like something, but it actually isn't.
So it's like programmer art.
Yeah.
Right. Sort of. It's like code, but you look at it, oh, that's art. But I guess in the background, you're using whatever tools you got.
Yeah, whatever passes for art, I guess, is good enough for here. So
I have a question though. What we're looking at is sort of this scene, but you're saying it's text. It looks like there's some green, there's some like discolored green that's a little bit lighter. It looks like there's probably 20 rows of grass. Are you randomly generating the little splotches? Is that hard coded? Like where it changes from green to slightly lighter green to back to dark green?
No, so these are all drawn by hand. So I use a MacBook as my daily driver. I have a program called Pixen that is kind of like it's intended to be like a pixel art program where you can draw like you do in like Microsoft Paint, for example. Pixen has some tools at its disposal that are more geared towards like two-dimensional art. So you can do things like two-dimensional animation sequences and layering and so on and so forth. But this is all drawn by hand. So what I'll do is I'll create the image in Pixen and save it as a bitmap. And then I take that bitmap and give it to a program that I wrote that will take the image data from the bitmap file itself and then convert all of that to a JSON file that contains an array of RGB values per pixel. And then the JSON file is ingested when the program runs, and it creates from that JSON file the string that makes the image that you see on the screen here.
All right, random thought. And I'm sorry, I'm just having fun because this is, it extends, like for me to do something like this would be like the highlight of my whole life. So there's a lot of unexplored territory here for me. And one is, so there's this REPL thing. Could you explain what that is really quick and why that is related to TUI?
Yeah, so REPL, commonly announced or pronunciated as REPL. Said read, evaluate, print, and loop. Kind of the basic premise of any text interface. So you'll type commands in, you press enter, the computer evaluates those commands, generates some output, prints that output to the terminal, either above, below, somewhere else, whatever. The point is that it reacts to it and outputs something, and then you loop back over to the R portion. So you loop back into reading. So you're constantly in the state of like, reading input, evaluating it, printing some stuff out to the screen, and then looping back over again.
And with this type of game, right, it's not like a Call of Duty where you're running around and that kind of thing. It lends itself well to PowerShell because maybe there would be some limitations if you're trying to get like 120 frames per second. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll go programmer nerdy on you for a second. So it is possible to, as many of your viewers might know, it is possible to actually create like, WinForms applications using PowerShell because the CLR is there and you can just import those directly into PowerShell and use it that way. So, I mean, you could theoretically do something like that, but you lose the spirit of, what you're trying to do here. And PowerShell facilitates, like I said, just this stream manipulation interface with just directly in the terminal. This seats pretty well to what PowerShell is capable of doing.
And with the way you've written it, imagine you wanted to add a little bit of animation. So on the right-hand side, there's that sort of image of the grass, with some clouds in the sky and stuff. What if you wanted to animate the clouds to slowly move across the sky?
So
would that be a thing that you could do with your current way you've done the classes and set it up?
It could. It would take a bit more augmentation to make that work, right? Because the foundation of two-dimensional animation is that it's nothing more than just a sequence of stills, kind of like if anybody's familiar with drawing the little characters on the side of the sticky note papers, and you just flip the tab over and let it run, and then that makes the animation. Doing it in programming is no different, right? So you would have to make images for each frame of animation and then loop through them. Now, it would be possible to do it, and I have kicked around that idea. But it's not something that I've actually implemented into the program. It would be doable though. The issue you would run into here mostly is where the cursor positioning is here relative to it updating the content over here. Because right now it is blocked, waiting for input.
If you end up looking at adding that feature, would you mind looping me in? Because I'd love to sort of see how involved I can at least follow along the process or see that. Because I don't know, this stuff's so cool. Anytime you can add life to the console and the terminal, where some of us work away many hours a day, it's just like a breath of fresh air. Let's not forget the fact we have tons of work responsibilities, and let's just enjoy the pretty colors.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of the motivator for this too. I mean, when I first started doing these scene images, they were very static. There were no gimmicks like dithering or different colored pixels to influence different things on the images. It was just like, hey, here's this brown thing in the center of it that looks like a road, and there's green stuff on the side that looks like grass. But I've gotten a bit more artsy with them, and there are ones that have like rivers on the right side, on the south side. There's a couple. I just started working on cave systems, drawing those out, and and because it's being painted in Pixin, I can be a little bit more expressive. Now, that said, these are fixed dimensions, so it is like I think it's 48 by 18. So it's a limited space to work with, but you can still be pretty expressive just with that small amount of space.
Yeah. Oh gosh. The possibilities are endless.
Yeah.
So pretty much the only time with your kind of REPL loop now, the only time anything in the interface updates is upon typing in and sending a command.
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. Everything has, I would say, like a status flag associated to it. So like with this particular status window here on the top left, the HP values, the MP values, the gold, they all have, say, like, I'll call them dirty flags. It's weird as that sounds, but that's how they're referenced in code. They're dirty flags. So when the dirty flag is raised, it triggers the program to hey, on your next iteration, this needs refreshed, and it'll change it on the fly. But that all depends again on what actions we take inside the input interface here, and then consequently the battle program when we get into that portion of it, and anything else that goes along with the player.
So cool. Now I'm thinking here. What's up with sounds? Because I don't know if we'll be able to hear it on the podcast.
I don't know if we're. I don't know.
Is that part of the game?
Yeah, I don't know if we'll be able to hear it here either, especially because this is in. I virtualized my Windows machine in UTM on my Mac, but the program, the one slightly anachronistic thing that this program does is I do play back high fidelity audio during the battle sequences. So whenever you do move between map tiles, and if you do happen to get into a random encounter, there is a battle theme that plays. And there's a little chime that plays if you win the battle. There's a little chime that plays if you lose the battle. And these are just they're actual wave files that are stored in the directory of the game program. So it's, like I said, it's slightly anachronistic because you wouldn't be able to do waveform generation otherwise. I did kick around the idea at one point of doing like PC speaker sound effects to be a little bit more authentic to like a retro style.
Oh, like PC speaker meaning like the motherboard type speaker.
Yes. Yeah. So Windows has like has a very small function called beep in its API that you can use, and you can play like different tonal frequencies at different lengths to the speaker. So in the game code for Eldoria, there's a directory called labs, and in that labs directory, there's a few PowerShell scripts where you can see that I attempted to create like an entire note table with different octaves. And then what I would do is make take a song, turn it into a note table, put it into a list or an array. And then the program would look through that array and try to play the song based off of the note composition in it. And to a certain extent, it works. But there's problems with it in terms of sometimes too many beep calls can go to the speaker and they clobber each other. So there's a bit of race condition with that. And it just didn't sound good most of the time. And there's the other thing with the speaker too, is like there's some certain frequencies that the speaker just can't do. So like lower octaves can't be done. So you'd have to shift everything up an octave. So the song wouldn't necessarily sound like you would know what song you were listening to, like the Ghostbusters theme, for example, but it didn't sound quite right because it was like keyed up an octave.
Yeah.
So there was just weird issues like that with it. So I just said, screw it. We'll go with I can import, Windows Presentation Foundation, use the media player object, and then we can play WAV files that way.
Interesting. Yeah, I was thinking you could do, I'm not saying you should do this, but you could put like a jump scare in here. Really. Yeah. Set the volume all the way up.
That opportunity is there. This could very easily turn into a horror game really quick. But that depends on your definition of a horror game. Like if you're looking at this now, you're probably like, oh man, this is a horror game. Why am I playing a text-based game?
It's for the nostalgia. Hey, what about Dwarf Fortress? Did you play that?
I have not played Dwarf Fortress now.
That's sort of, I've never played it either, but I've seen the images and it's like, there's ones are trees and the nines are, you run around these numbers.
Yeah. It sounds like Minesweeper a little bit. I've had people compare this to games like Telengard, which I've never played that one, although I did some research afterwards when the comparison was made to see what that was like. And I guess it sort of kind of looks like it, but that predates me dramatically. A lot of my motivator actually in spirit was the Phantasy Star games, the classic ones, 1 through 3 on the Sega Genesis. I have a pretty strong affinity for those games, and some of what inspired like the look, or at least the approach to it, comes from playing those games in particular.
That is quite the dedication you've made to it. Now, this was a question that came up earlier on PowerShell Wednesday, and I want to make sure I ask it here because it was pretty good. How much time have you spent on this? I know you have a lot of things you're sort of juggling, job, family, and all this, but how long did it take you to get to where you are in the project?
So the project itself is a little over 2 years old entirely. The earliest renditions of this engine took life within maybe about 5 months. So the very first iterations of this game just had what you see here on the screen right now. It was literally just a string here, string here, string here, blah. And there was like there was no relation to them. It was just what can I get working with as little effort as possible. So I would say this portion right here and the earliest parts of it took about 5 months. That the difficult part was the handling the command interface, because the command interface is there's a few properties about it specifically, but it is length restricted. So, and it's confined to the length of the window here. So there can only be, I think, like 13 characters that your command phrases could be. And that's, of course, an artificial limitation, but it's a limitation nonetheless. But PowerShell, using, say, like I think it's the read host commandlet, you can't have that kind of granular control with read host. There's ways you can get around it if you think about it a little bit, but when you need to dynamically update displays and have more control over like characters going in here and like character level buffer control, the read host commandlet just wasn't going to work. So I had to do a lot of trial and error and testing to see, what kind of solution I could come up with here. And PowerShell fortunately allows you to get at the Windows APIs for controlling, individual character input, kind of the same way. I'm going to go Linux here, kind of the same way you do with like the ncurses library with the get.ch function. Windows has an analog for that, and you can pretty easily use that to just analyze every character as it comes in and control the length. But that was the hardest part with this portion here.
Slight turn here. Greg, at this point in the podcast, listeners are thinking, holy beep, Greg knows his stuff. Now, and not only that, you've kind of gone in a bunch of different directions with your career over the years, it sounds like, right? Network stuff, doing all this programmer stuff, Linux stuff, curses or whatever you're talking about. I mean, I think I've heard that mentioned. I've never used it. What is your driving force for being someone who seems to have learned a ton of stuff? Why are you it seems like there's a certain curiosity about you. What's going on there?
Aside from sadomasochism, I think that I just have an inherent curiosity about things, and it may, the way it comes up is probably stereotypical. If most people have like these images in their heads, like, oh, I was that kid that was taking apart my Nintendo to try to figure out how it worked, or taking apart the swing set to try to put it back together and that sort of stuff. So it really just boiled down to that. But the thing with programming, I was a little bit of a latecomer to programming. I didn't start programming until I was probably about 14 or 15 years old. And whenever this whole world of, logic and software and everything, whenever that was introduced to me, I don't know, I think it just rewired my brain to a certain extent. So now I just have this deeply inlaid curiosity of, I see a computer doing this. How can I replicate it? Or I have these things that I want to do with the computer, either for work or that I think that would benefit myself or even my children to a certain extent. So like, how can I go about making those things? And that's what drives me to do all this stuff. And technology just, as it just metamorphoses over time without prompting. So it's always there. If you want to continue to grow, this is the place to be at.
So you sort of have used your curiosity to drive your career and sort of explore new areas.
Yeah.
And as you've done that, sort of now you've had, I guess, sounds like a couple decades of experience doing that. What is your perspective like? Like, are there any sort of overarching lessons that you've learned from diving into X, Y, and Z, and you've seen the kind of similar patterns and things like that? What are some of the bigger takeaways that you've learned that have taken maybe learning 5 different things to sort of see? I know it's kind of a weird question, but
no, I like the nebulous ones. As I would say, probably as anticlimactic as it sounds, I do think it really boils down to you just have to have an ingrained passion to continue to learn and evolve with the technology and the tools that you use, and more specifically, how those tools map onto the real world. Because if you're making tools for the sake of the tool, that's fine, but it's not really useful for anything other than that. You know what I mean? Like you want people to use tools. You want computers to be useful for people. You want them to accomplish things. You don't want them to be hindrances. You don't want them to slow people down, or in worst case, keep people from getting their paychecks. So I think, and maybe I heard this from Steve Jobs at one point. I don't remember, but listening to an interview with him or something to that effect. But I think you have to start with really start your thought process with the product first and kind of work your way backwards, rather than starting from I have this really, and I know that probably seems contradictory to what we're showing here, but if you just start with really cool tech, that tech is cool, but can you make something useful with it? Can you have people really jive with that? And I think if you don't have that passion for making good usable products for people, you kind of just, I don't know, you don't really evolve or grow with anything, if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense. That's the sort of the wisdom. Take some time to see. Interesting. If you wanted people out there to take away one thing, and maybe that could be related to career and the curiosity thing, or maybe that could be related to passion about PowerShell and your takeaways as someone who's invested a lot of time and sort of seen the nitty gritty of what PowerShell can do. What is a takeaway you have for people out there?
I think it would be, focus on what motivates you specifically. If you are able to identify pretty clearly what it is that you're passionate about, and try to figure out ways that you can expand your horizons, expand your knowledge. Don't be afraid to do those kinds of things. That just doing and at the risk of sounding a little bit emotional or romantic about it, with this game program here. I mean, when I started out doing PowerShell stuff, it was everything that perhaps your listeners or anybody else would think of use PowerShell for, which is systems automation, orchestration, build automation, troubleshooting, control, that sort of stuff. And that's exactly where PowerShell seats at. But I mean, a little bit of creativity, ingenuity, and you can do something as weird as this thing is. So just don't be afraid to explore and play with things. I mean, just let it go, man. Let it all go. Have fun with it.
I like that. And I think, I don't know if you've said it in these words, but there's a certain amount of you said focus on what motivates you, but there's a certain amount of chase your curiosity, right? If something motivates you, if you're interested in diving into something, don't be hesitant to do it. Just go do it. Yeah. And I think that when you do that, it becomes a more renewable resource. We all get inspired to dive into X, Y, or Z, and that can last for maybe a week or so. But in order to have a sustained amount, I think like what you've had with your career, I think you need to be able to enjoy it.
Yeah.
So whatever that means for you.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, probably won't go too deep into that stuff, but I mean, the thing with me is I'm a college dropout. I'm not formally educated in anything, but I have this. I just have this really strong desire for what I do. I love doing technology. I eat, sleep, breathe it. It's just what I do, and I really jive with it. So I just keep pushing the gas pedal as hard as I can, and I think that's what's important. Like I said, it's having a passion for what you do, and then really pursuing it, not being afraid to do things like, be a jack of all trades, get your feet dirty in other things outside of your comfort zone, or even do something silly like make PowerShell games. So just have fun with it.
Yeah, it sounds like there's an element of taking ownership of not just the role you have at your current job, but as a technologist or someone working with technology. And then also a certain amount of being invested in being able to take pride in what you do. Not just, we can all get the paycheck part, but it's more than just that. It is being invested in a way that can fuel you. You put this hard work out there and invest yourself in it, and it's successful. That makes you feel great. That fuels the next thing, rather than just kind of phoning it in. And, there's a big difference in, I think that ties back to what you were talking about earlier of being efficient and stuff.
Yep, absolutely.
Greg, I learned a lot. I mean, this was great. People want to check out the game. Where should they get started?
Well, the repository for it is on GitHub. You can download the repo, and the run instructions are in there. Usual things, set your execution policy to bypass, and then go ahead and run it. Everything, so long as you keep everything together from the repository, because the for example, the assets are not baked into the PowerShell script itself. So you got to keep everything together. Don't move it around. But you can download it, run it, and see what the source code's there. Again, it's 100% PowerShell, except for some JSON here and there. Feel free to contribute if you want. I've said this before. I'm not a tyrannical dictator over my code. It's up on GitHub for a reason. And so go ahead and have fun with it. Ask me questions through the GitHub if you want. I'm not really big on social media, but if you want to interact with me on GitHub through the code, that's fine. And that's about.
You have a website.
I do, unfortunately. It's the martinmethod.com. It is I've got a personal blog, but I do a lot of programming blogging on there as well.
Pixel art. That's awesome.
Yeah, so I do post like updates with pixel art and updates with the game progress and so on and so forth. So it's interspersed with other goofy posts that I put on there. So
Greg, this was a fantastic conversation. Such a pleasure. We brought the green shirts. We brought the good vibes. You brought the PowerShell skills. I didn't bring much to the table there today, but I learned a lot. And I think it was really cool how we were able to cover some deep technical stuff. And, I love to squeeze in that little soft skills side of things a little bit and sort of the lessons learned along the way. And I think that you had a nice mixture of being able to enjoy what you do, also be successful at it, and definitely on the fun side of things, especially, making a video game.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool. Definitely check that out, everybody. Eldoria. We can find you on your personal blog, which is sort of like modern day social media. Sort of.
Yeah,
and,
sort of.
I think we're going to have you on for another episode in the future. Check out PowerShell Wednesdays every single Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern time. PowerShell podcast every single Monday. Give us a like, comment, subscribe, share it with a friend, share it with a coworker, share it with an old school gamer. Doesn't everybody have one of those in their lives? Maybe you're that old school gamer. Maybe I'm that old school gamer. Who knows? What else am I supposed to say, Greg? You got any shout outs? I know some of your shout outs if you don't know your shout outs.
I think I remember some of my shout outs. So first of all, to you and the PowerShell community of PDQ, I'm a fairly new member in that area, but it's lively and I enjoy being in there. And thanks for having me on the PowerShell Wednesdays. Big shout out to the LinkedIn users group or the PowerShell users group on LinkedIn. Sorry. A couple members on there were pretty good about encouraging a lot of growth and movement on some of this stuff. So shout out to that group. And then obviously my family for putting up with my insanity of programming and everything I do. So
awesome. VS Code, NeoVim.
Preference on NeoVim.
Yeah.
I do use VS Code now it's on my MacBook. It runs a lot better than it did on my Windows machine. But I still use NeoVim.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to hopefully having a chat with you in the future because you have some pretty hot takes on formatting based on your experience that I've never seen before. And I've seen a lot of people write PowerShell. I've looked at a lot of repos. I have never seen what you have going on. To be continued. Thanks again, though, Greg.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast. The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.